videos here in about a week and a half. All right, let's get down to it. So first of all, we're again talking about the social aspect of the age of absolutism. We are still in the old regime, the ancien regime, the three estates hierarchy, the first estate, the clergy; second estate, the nobility; third estate, everybody else. We are continuing to see these urban artisans not really match well with the rest of the peasant population. I think, yeah, in the next video, we'll see all that come to a head as we talk about the Enlightenment, as we talk about the American Revolution and the French Revolution. But just to give you an idea, we do have peasants in two areas living very different lives. So let's talk about them real quick. I'll spend some more time on the bourgeoisie in the next video. So first off, in Western Europe, peasants live a very different life than in Eastern Europe. Western Europe, we've got later marriage, and this goes back to the last video when we talked about how peasants had to establish their own households, and so because of that, we saw later marriage because they've got to save up that money, and so it's only after they've saved up that money that the man and the woman can get married. Because they're getting married in their later 20s as opposed to their earlier 20s or their late teens, you see smaller families, mostly because women just aren't able to have as many children because they're getting married 10 to 6 years later than their Eastern European counterparts. Also remember that childbirth is incredibly dangerous, and that it's even more so for older women. So that's why it's another reason why you see smaller families. We've got single generation households, which we just talked about. That's the man and the woman moving away to form their own household. But you've also got free peasants. Peasants in most of Britain and France and the Netherlands have greater freedom to move around more so than in Eastern Europe, where they practice serfdom, where the serf is bound to the land because they're bound to do work for their lord. In Western Europe, we see peasants able to move from one land to another, but also to move into the cities or the towns if they feel like that is something that would be better for them. So let's move on to Eastern Europe. In Eastern Europe, we've got a lot of differences. Earlier marriage, so landlords, because they want more serfs and because they want more people to work their land, they actually encourage their serfs to get married at a much earlier age, and they encourage these large families. Now it's not 9 to 20 kids, that would be nuts. But the households are multi-generational, remember, so we'll see you might have a husband and a wife, and probably the husband's parents living within the household. You might have aunts and uncles living also within the household, and so you're going to have grandparents, parents, and you're going to have kids, and so you might even have great grandparents because the marriage age is so young in Eastern Europe, and so they might be getting married. They're getting married at like 17. It's a distinct possibility that great grandma is still around, or the great grandpappy is still there. We already talked about serfdom. So big differences between Western European serfs and Western European peasants and Eastern European peasants. And these are differences that you're going to see impact over time, right? So the freedom that peasants have to move from the countryside into a city is going to help facilitate some of that early industrial revolution labor movement that you're going to see. Remember, one of the reasons that Eastern Europe industrializes so much later than Western Europe is in part because of serfdom. Serfs are just not able to move to the cities like these industries need. And this is this agricultural basis of the economy in Eastern Europe that we see kind of holding them back. And so we don't just talk about the peasants because we want to talk about the peasants. We talk about the peasants because it has implications, not just for this time period, but for future time periods. And we'll talk about that again in a subsequent video. As far as the political spectrum goes, we've got the whole unit is about absolutism versus constitutionalism. And so on one side, you've got absolutism. You've got guys like Bossuet, who's arguing for a divine right monarch, the idea that God put the monarch in charge, and that the monarch, as a result, is the appointed person, the appointed ruler. God gave them that authority, and so you have to listen to the monarch because they speak for God. You've also got Thomas Hobbes. Remember, he's an English philosopher who argues for a secular absolute monarch. He says that if we didn't have a strong absolute monarch, a Leviathan. Remember the Leviathan picture, that big giant person who's made up of all sorts of other people. If we didn't have an absolute monarch to control the people, then it would be war of every man against every man. Remember, this is the guy who thinks that you want to stab him and take his stuff, and all he really wants to do is stab you and take your stuff. That's Thomas Hobbes. And so both Bossuet and Hobbes argue for an absolute monarch. They just have different reasons behind it. Hobbes says we need an absolute monarch for safety. Bossuet says we need an absolute monarch because God put them there, and you have to listen to the monarch because God said so. And so these are the two main philosophers of absolutism. And then you've got the rulers. You've got James I of England. He's really the reason that this time period starts in 1603, because that's when he takes the throne. He argues rather openly for divine right monarchy. Louis XIV believes again in divine right monarchy. He thinks that God put him there, as does Peter the Great. The Habsburgs are absolutists. They would probably argue divine right, even though we didn't really study them a whole lot. And then Prussia emerges as a great power. Again, they would probably argue divine right as opposed to secular monarchy. I don't think there are a lot of kings that really argue that you need a monarch for safety's sake. They're not going to say that they're not going to openly say that Hobbes is wrong, but they're not probably going to claim that as their authority, because ultimately that authority then rests on the people. And most of these monarchs would argue that their authority doesn't come from the people, it comes from themselves or from God. And so they're probably going to push more for the Bossuet idea than the Hobbes idea, but they're going to welcome Hobbes. I should get off this and move on to constitutionalism. All right, so constitutionalism, this is sort of the other side. There are two big examples here. The first being the Dutch Republic. And it is a republic. There is voting. There are representatives. Remember that this is the Dutch Golden Age. This is the 1600s to the 1700s. This is the era when the Dutch just have so many more boats that they're able to dominate global trade and the maritime trade. And we'll talk about that when we get down to economics. But the Dutch Republic, they want representation. They want the people to have a voice. And so this is also the era when the Dutch rise up against the Spanish and fight for freedom against the Spanish. And it's not just the Dutch Protestants who want that, although primarily the Dutch Protestants do want that. It's also the Dutch Catholics who want that as well. And so you've got the Protestants and the Catholics claiming this cultural idea of representation and republic. And later they're going to split into Protestant and Catholic. The Catholics are going to go back to Spain, but the Dutch Republic will remain with its rough republican form. And then you've got the English Civil War that comes along after James I. So James I dies. His son Charles I also tries to claim divine right monarchy. The English Parliament is really getting tired of this. They really don't like where all this is going. And so, Charles eventually just makes them all so angry that there's an open conflict, a civil war. We've got the Cavaliers under Charles, the Roundheads under the Parliament. They fight each other. Charles eventually gets captured and is beheaded in 1649. Then you bring in Oliver Cromwell, who's supposed to rule with Parliament and basically rules as a military dictator. Once he's dead, they bring back Charles II in what's called the Restoration. Charles II, remember, secretly wants to be Catholic. It eventually does convert to Catholicism on his deathbed. And then his brother, James II, who's openly Catholic, becomes king. And at first, Parliament is like, okay, we can probably do this. But then when James has a son, Parliament basically says, okay, we can't do this. We can't have a Catholic king and a Protestant country. We're just not going to be about that. And so they invite William and Mary in the Glorious Revolution and kick out James II in 1688. William and Mary become Queen and King of England. And so both in the Dutch Republic and in England, we end up with a we end up with sort of a constitutional Republican form. Remember, you've got Parliament, they're supposed to represent the people. But keep in mind that this is not a republic like we have here in the United States. This is not a republic that represents everybody. This is a republic that represents the rich. Remember that Parliament is controlled by the nobility. You could just as easily say that this Constitution that's brought up, that's drawn up during the Glorious Revolution, that William and Mary have to agree that Parliament hires the king and queen. It's a constitution, it's a republic, but it's also the nobility versus the king. Remember that all of this sort of is the result of those new monarchies that we talked about back in the Renaissance video. That as the monarchs consolidate power and they sideline the nobility, you get either an absolutist result or a constitutionalist result, it seems, or somewhere in between. The absolute monarchs are never as absolute as they would like us to believe they are. They always rely at least a little bit on the nobility, especially as we have seen in Prussia with the Junkers. But in England, you can see that the nobility have reconquered and taken back that power from the king. In fact, they've probably gotten more than they lost in all this. And then don't forget about Poland. Remember in Poland that the nobles are in charge and that they elect the kings. And because the nobles want all the power, they actually elect weak foreigners as their king. And so this is just a terrible system. Just a terrible system. The nobles always elect a weak king. The nobles never listen to the king, and they are always trying to push the king one way or the other. In the end, what's going to happen is Poland's not going to be united enough to defend itself when it needs to be defended. And so Poland is not going to last much longer. But we know. All right, let's move on to religion. So the age of absolutism and constitutionalism, at least in part, comes out of this idea of religious conflict. That out of the wars of religion of the 1600s, we get a lot of this absolutist idea, and a lot of the conflict within religion is also leads to the age of absolutism. So two big causes of the age of absolutism are the new monarchies that we talked about in the first video, and the religious conflict that we talked about in the second video. And those both sort of lead into the age of absolutism. People want safety. And so that's one argument that's made, is that an absolute monarch brings safety. That's what Thomas Hobbes said, right? We just did that. So religion, though, by and large, is not as big a deal during this era. We are past the politiques of Henry IV of Navarre and Elizabeth I of England. They set a good precedent. Tolerance is seen as very popular. All the cool kids are doing it. Be tolerant. Just chill. Everybody just chill. It's cool. England is relatively tolerant as long as you're Protestant. And you can be Catholic in England. You're just probably not going to get a whole lot of perks to your life. So they're pretty tolerant. Remember that Elizabethan settlement that we talked about in class, where the Anglican Church under Elizabeth is both a little bit Protestant and a little bit Catholic. It's sort of a diet Catholic. It's a little bit country and a little bit rock and roll. In France, Louis XIV revokes the Edict of Nantes. And remember, this is seen as super intolerant and seen as a really big mistake. And also seen, sort of shows Louis as this really old, out of touch guy. Sort of seen as, I hate to use the word backward, but that's really the word that comes to mind. That this is not the way we do things anymore, Louis. You're supposed to be chill. But he revokes the Edict of Nantes. The Huguenots the persecution of the Huguenots dramatically increases, which then leads to that letter that we read in class, where the Prussian elector, Frederick William, invites the French Huguenots to please move to Prussia. Please move to Prussia. Prussia is a very small state. It's not a very wealthy state. Their soil is terrible. And these Huguenots, remember the Edict of Nantes said that the Huguenots should live in towns. And so a lot of these Huguenots because they're supposed to live in these walled towns where they can practice their religion openly. They pick up on these town talents, these businesses. They become, hat makers and wheel makers and cart makers and all these urban bourgeois, rich sort of trades. The Huguenots are very good at. And so Frederick William, the Great Elector, is very welcoming of the Huguenot. Please come to Prussia, set up your shop. It'll be free. It'll be great. And this also makes Prussia look great because they're seen as being very tolerant. And they're, so religion is not as big a deal. There aren't a whole lot of wars that are going to be fought over it, but it's just there in the background the whole time. And you can kind of see this with Galileo and the Inquisition. This is the time period when Galileo's trial would have been. 1633 is when Galileo gets put on trial. We're talking about how the sun is at the center of the universe. And it seems though at this point in the age of absolutism we should be beyond that, but we're really not. And so Galileo, remember, is found guilty by the Inquisition of coming up with new ideas, which is violates the Council of Trent. He's not allowed to interpret the Bible for himself, and so he is found guilty, put on house arrest. But hey, at least they didn't torture and kill him, right? All right, let's move on to intellectual. During this time period, we're seeing the scientific revolution wrapping up. And the scientific revolution sort of wraps up with Newton. Newton publishes his major work, the Principia Mathematica, in 1687. This is the one where he puts forward that idea of inertia, that idea of gravity. He'll later publish a book, setting up calculus. Newton found calculus very difficult when he was inventing it. Just missing. He didn't really. The guy's like brilliant. Anyway, this is also the time period when you see the death of a lot of the big names of the scientific revolution. Bacon, dead, 1626. Kepler, dead, 1630. Descartes, dead, 1650. Newton's going to last into the 1700s, but he publishes during this time period, and so that was the big idea. And so we're starting to see the pre-Enlightenment fire up. John Locke is going to publish his major works around the same time as Newton publishes his major work. Locke publishes the Essay Concerning Human Understanding, publishes his two treatises on government, an essay concerning toleration. And so Locke is sort of setting up the Enlightenment. And so we're seeing that first wave of Bossuet, Hobbes, Locke going away. We're seeing that first wave of Galileo, Kepler, Newton going away right about the time of the absolute monarchs. And then after the age of absolute monarchs is really, or toward the end of the age of absolute monarchs is when we're going to start to see the flowering of the Enlightenment. Remember, at 1715, the end of this time period is when Louis XIV dies, and Louis XV takes the throne. And it's during that Louis XV phase that you're gonna see things like the Rococo, the Salons, and the Enlightenment really take off as we move toward the American Revolution, the French Revolution. But that's in the next video, so not today. As far as technology goes, we're just kind of moving on the same track. We see the invention of a lot of astronomical instruments, things that Kepler, Galileo, Newton would have used. You also see Jethro Tull. His seed drill makes an appearance during this time period in the early 1700s, and that's one of those things that's going to kick off the agricultural revolution. It's going to lead to a lot more food, a lot fewer famines, and is going to lead to that population increase in the countryside that's going to push those French and English peasants out of the countryside and into the towns looking for work. It's going to help fuel the initial industrial revolution, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in the next video, and definitely in the one after that. And you also get the advent of Baroque art, or you get the continuation of Baroque art, I should say. Baroque art is, remember, not just the Catholic Counter-Reformation, but also the art of absolutism, that we want things to be big, we want things to be glitzy, we want things to be shiny. We want people to walk into a room and go, holy cow, this is awesome. You get Versailles, you get the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles, and you get other Baroque touches in England, for which the king gets made fun of and a lot. but you also get, Versailles getting mimicked around Europe in Vienna, in Berlin, in all the major capitals. You start to see the Baroque pop up. And then last but not least, we got the economic aspect. This is the age of absolutism. This is the age of mercantilism and the Dutch Golden Age. Remember that the Dutch, they just have way more boats than everybody else, and so they just start moving things from place to place to place to place to place. We get the Anglo-Dutch Wars, fighting for maritime dominance. We get American colonization. We've got the Dutch moving in the Indian Ocean and trading with the Spice Islands become sole property of the Dutch. But again, this idea of mercantilism, the idea that there's only this much wealth in the world, and that you got to get a slice of it, because if you take a slice of it, then that means somebody else gets weaker. Remember, we did that on the whiteboard. And so the idea here is to become self-sufficient. And that's why there's this big push for American colonization. We need sugar. You go and get a sugar colony in the Caribbean. We need wood. Go and get a colony in the Americas so you can harvest trees. Whatever you need, go. If you can't make it yourself, go and take over a place where you can make it. That way you don't have to trade, because remember, trade is bad. You want a constant favorable balance of trade. You want to sell more than you buy, because that way you get a bigger slice of the pie, and your opponent has to give you their gold in order to buy your stuff. And so when they give you that gold, their slice of the pie gets smaller. And when you get gold, your slice of the pie gets bigger. And so remember that wealth, especially gold and silver, become measures of not just wealth, but also of power. Because what can you do with money? Whatever you want. You can spend it on better guns, better boats, better armies. You can use it to send boats and armies, to make more boats and armies to send out to get more colonies. The idea here being that controlling your economy is the only way to do this, and controlling it strictly is the only way to make sure that your slice gets bigger and everybody else's slice gets smaller, which of course is going to lead to a lot of restrictions. That's going to lead to, the American War of Independence and other wars of independence around the world, as these colonies, who are basically getting wealth extracted from them by the mother country, they get unhappy. They don't want this. And you're also going to get the publication of The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, which is going to put forth a new idea of capitalism, the idea of free trade. And that's going to be the economic system of not the next video, but the video after that.